It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Will Steffen. Will is the Executive Director of the Climate Change Institute at the Australian National University. He's also a member of the Climate Commission, which is an independent body providing information on the climate change to the Australian public. He's published widely on climate change, with a focus on sustainability issues, including adapting land use to climate change. And in 2011, he was the principal author of The Critical Decade, a climate report for the Australian government, which provided the scientific underpinning for the government's action on climate change through the introduction of a price on carbon emissions. So Will, you're going to have a keynote for us. Welcome.
Thank you very much, and Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's indeed an honor to be here, because often I think we don't really hear the voice of science in such a prominent role. So I'm very grateful for the opportunity to try to represent my colleagues who've been trying to inject science into a lot of these deliberations surrounding climate change. But today I'm going to talk beyond climate, because I think it's within the theme of what we've heard already in terms of living landscapes or sustainable landscapes, going beyond looking at individual parts of land systems, looking at them in a more integrated way, but also looking at the Earth system in a more integrated way. We tend to silo climate a little bit too much, in my view, even though I work in that area. So one of the things I'm going to do is to talk about what we call land systems. That's very familiar to you because you would know them as landscapes. And we talk a lot about the interplay between forest, woodlands, savannas, grasslands, managed systems such as pastures and croplands, and how they operate in the context of the Earth system. So the second thing I'm going to talk about is the Earth system, the planetary environment as a single system, of which climate is one part, an important part, but there are others. Okay, occasionally I am going to refer to something called the planetary boundaries framework. A very simple concept. The Earth is finite. You can fly around it in probably a day and a half if you wanted to stay in an airplane that long. But also it's finite in many other ways. And as science knows more about it, it knows where there are intrinsic limits. I call them hardwired, things that we can't change, like the freezing point and boiling point of water. Sounds simple? It's important for how the planet operates. It's a water planet. So we have come up with what we think is the minimum set 9 planetary boundaries that we need to observe if we want to have a planet in which humans can thrive, which is the ultimate goal. Climate's only one, so I'll talk about a few others. But let me go back now and start with forests, because this is Forest Day 6, and talk about them not in just a climate, but in an Earth system context. It's interesting that when we looked at our 9 boundaries, one of our 9 boundaries is in fact land systems, in their own right, equal with climate in importance, okay? Now, in each of our boundaries we have what we call a control variable, which is an indicator to see how we're tracking. It's interesting, and you'll be pleased to know that for land systems, our control boundary is the amount of forested land on planet Earth. We think that's the single most important thing about land systems. But we look at the interplay of forest with other types of land covers when we look at our boundary. All right, very briefly, you all know about the role of forests in the climate system. It's one of the objectives of this conference here in Doha. Forests store a lot of carbon. They have the possibility to emit carbon, so the balance is always changing between forests and the atmosphere. However, I want to dispel one myth, and I'll dispel a couple more as I go through. One is, from a scientific point of view, you cannot offset fossil fuel emissions by trying to shove more carbon into forests. Carbon in forests is important in its own right for a whole number of reasons to do, not just with climate, but with productivity, resilience, livelihoods, and so on. So forests are indeed important, but you can't take the pressure off fossil fuel emissions by saying, we'll just put it all into forests. Scientifically, it doesn't work. Forests are also important in the climate system for another reason. For example, tropical forests, particularly the Amazon basin, is very important as a controller of atmospheric circulation. If you lose too much of that forest, First of all, you'll start a self-reinforcing process of losing a lot more of it. And second of all, you will affect atmospheric circulation in areas as far away as Europe and Northern Asia and elsewhere. It is part of the global system. Forests also play a role, particularly the northern ones, the so-called boreal forests, which often don't get into discussions about forests. They're extremely important for the energy balance at the Earth's surface because the interplay of low-lying vegetation, tundra, grassland, steppes, and boreal forest vastly affects the albedo or reflectivity of the Earth's surface, particularly in late winter and spring when there's a snow cover. That affects the whole global circulation system. So forests are important in their own right besides the carbon issue. But we've heard already from speakers before how important forests are in terms of ecosystem services, a term that scientists use for a lot of things we've heard about. Examples being filtering of nitrogen and phosphorus. Forests play an important role in that. Provision of fresh water. Let me give you an example. New York City, about a decade or two ago, was faced with increasing its water supply as its consumption grew. It had two options. One was to build a big modern filtration plant. The other was to actually pay people to be better managers of the forests and other landscapes in the catchment. It turned out to be more cost-effective to do the latter, and it produced better water. This is a good example of an ecosystem service, another service that forests provide for humanity. And of course, there are other ones. We derive a lot of recreational and indeed inspirational values. It's part of many human cultures. The Indian civilization has a long tradition of sacred groves or sacred forests, and almost all cultures use forest in an inspirational way. We heard a lot about mangroves, and I'm really glad to see that on there because mangroves provide one of the most important ecosystem services, and it will become even more important as this century progresses. Of course, it stores carbon, as all forests do, but it also provides coastal protection. We saw this during the Boxing Day tsunami, where those areas in Southeast Asia where it had well-functioning, intact mangrove forests suffered less damage from the tsunami. Why do I say it's increasingly important? Well, it's likely that tropical cyclones are going to become more intense as the century progresses as a result of shifts in the climate system. This means that the potential for damage along vulnerable coastlines increases, hence even more important that we have well-functioning coastal forests, including mangrove forests. Well, I could go on and on there from a scientific point of view, but I wanted to leave science a little bit now and look at an interface between science and some social issues. One of the main constraints we have in dealing with the climate issue is not a scientific one. We understand the science very well. It's not even a technical one. We actually have a lot of alternative energy sources and so on. It's actually a socioeconomic one. And that comes down to what everyone knows, I think, is the elephant in the room, the social equity issues. Now, this also hits the planetary boundaries approach because one of the major criticisms of the idea that the fact that the Earth is finite and it has hardwired limits is it sounds like another attempt by the wealthy countries to put a cap on development of the poor countries. That's myth number two. Planetary boundaries are actually the opposite. There are many synergies between poverty alleviation, achieving better equity outcomes, and maintaining a stable Earth system. Just let me give you three examples of those. First one I mentioned earlier, nitrogen and phosphorus, and this plays right into the interplay between agricultural land, forests, and so on. We have a boundary for PNN, two big element cycles. It's one of the 9. And of course, the major use of these is as a fertilizer to improve productivity of agricultural lands. Very important to feed a growing human population. But if you look at where, for example, phosphorus is applied, it's vastly inequitable. There's huge excesses of phosphorus, mainly in agricultural lands in the northern hemisphere. We believe this transgresses a planetary boundary in terms of widespread eutrophication of freshwater systems, affects freshwater supplies, and it becomes planetary scale because it finds its way into the ocean and is starting to create large anoxic zones in large ocean basins. Planetary problem. On the other hand, there are other parts of the world, particularly Africa, where there is a lack of phosphorus, where it's required to improve productivity of poor soils and to help increase food security in the region. So, if you look at equity considerations and say, if you transferred resources where there is an excess of them to where there is a lack of them, you would come back within the planetary boundary, and at the same time, you would address equity issues. Other examples, aerosols, what are they? They're particles in the atmosphere. You'd know them as air pollution. They come from forests, actually. They come from burning wood for fuel, particularly cooking fuel. And it's a problem in South Asia still, and it threatens the stability of the Asian monsoon system, which then has implications for global circulation. Again, there are links all the way back to the Earth system in most of this. Look at the equity considerations. If better technologies could be brought into these regions that could build up local industries, improve local livelihoods, reduce aerosols, and very importantly, improve women's health, because it's predominantly women who suffer from the use of wood for cooking fuels, you would achieve a lot of social equity goals, and at the same time, you would come back down within the planetary boundaries. Biodiversity is another big one, because biodiversity is very uneven around the world. Obviously, in forested ecosystems, there's massively more biodiversity in tropical forests, for example, than there is in boreal forests. Biodiversity is important for controlling the biotic part of the Earth system. Think of it as a control panel, like in an airplane, that provides all the signals for the biosphere to work, as it does to stabilize the climate and other parts of the Earth system. And yet we're ripping it out at 100 to 1,000 times the background rate. If we could look at that as a global ecosystem service, where a globalized economy needs to pay for that ecosystem service, we could generate outcomes that improved livelihoods in those areas where these forests reside and other ecosystems reside, and at the same time, improve the Earth system outcome. So, in summary, there are a lot of synergies. Too often we hear about, well, you have to trade things off. Well, no, you don't. If you're clever and if you're wise, you can build synergies that deliver the environmental outcomes that you want, not just at the local and regional scale, very important, but at the Earth system scale. And at the same time, you can bring people out of poverty, you can reduce the inequalities around the world, and so on. I want to make one more comment about the equity issue, which is a controversial one, before I finish off talking a bit about the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. There's been some fascinating work done by a couple of researchers, epidemiologists, called Wilkinson and Pickett. What they've done is they've only looked at the OECD countries, the wealthy countries, and looked at them country by country and said, all right, let's just do two things. Let's look at a basket of social outcomes, things like crime rate, things like obesity, some of the social issues that affect wealthy countries. And let's look then at income inequality within those wealthy countries. That's looking within my country, within the USA, within European countries, within Japan, etc. There is a remarkable relationship, correlation. Those countries that have the lowest income inequality have the best social outcomes. It won't come as a surprise to you of which countries win. It's the Nordic countries, the Scandinavians plus Finland, and it's also Japan. Of course, the country that comes out worst may not surprise you either. It happens to be the USA. So there's a very interesting lesson. And that relationship, it's stronger the higher the scale is. So we're suggesting, from a planetary boundaries point of view, that if you look at inequalities between countries, not only within countries, the same relationship may well hold. That you may get better social outcomes around the world if you reduce the inequalities between the developing world and the developed world, the wealthy world. And as I said before, at the same time, that tends to keep us within the boundaries of planet Earth. Again, a global scale synergy. Research is controversial. A lot of people are fighting it. I'm putting it on the table as something we need to think about. So that's myth number 2, is that there's always a tension between meeting environmental goals and meeting human goals. It doesn't have to be that way, and I would argue in the 21st century it can't be that way. The last thing I want to talk about are the Sustainable Development Goals arising out of Rio + 20. We've heard often, again and again and again, about the 3 pillars of sustainability: economic, social, and environmental. And again, I hear many times about trade-offs. Scientists don't look at it as 3 pillars. We have a different view. We have it as a nested hierarchy. Think of 3 big circles, one big one, middle-sized, small one inside the other. The biggest one, not surprisingly from our view, is the environment. And it's very simple. We humans are physiological creatures. We are mammals with certain requirements for food, for temperature ranges, for water, for other things. No matter how wealthy we are, we can't get around that. And the environment has to provide that. It has to provide the services, the products that you're well aware that all the services that forests deliver and agriculture deliver. We need that. We need well-functioning systems. So that's the bottom line. And now in the 21st century, it's a global scale issue. We have to have a stable Earth system if 7 billion people and eventually 9 billion, 10 billion people are going to thrive. It's not negotiable. We simply cannot survive if that's not so. So that's the number one big circle. The next one, in fact, is social systems. And you can see that quite clearly. You need to have a well-functioning social system to support an economy that actually works. And so that's why I've spent as much time on social issues as I have on scientific ones. And we've got to make sure that we have well-functioning social systems within countries and particularly between countries to make this whole thing work. And the last one, of course, is economic. You have to have good economy that provides livelihoods, meaningful livelihoods, sustainable livelihoods, and so on. But you can't get that if you don't have a good social system and good governance and well-functioning institutions. So let me close then with going back up to that big circle and talk about, well, what do we actually need then in terms of sustainable development goals, in terms of the environment? First of all, I would agree with the previous speakers. We've got to keep our eye on the Millennium Development Goals. We have to continue to bring people out of poverty, improve livelihoods, et cetera, et cetera. We've made progress, but we've got to keep going on that. And there are other social goals, particularly sustainable consumption and production in wealthy countries, and equity issues, which are important. But returning to the environment, I mentioned that there are 9 planetary boundaries. I'm not going to go through all 9. I've mentioned a couple of them. I was talking to my own Minister for the Environment in Australia and briefing him and some other environment ministers on planetary boundaries, and he sort of waved his hand and he said, 9 is too much, 9 is too much. We in the policy community can't deal with 9. Can you actually get it down to something we can manage? And that's a good challenge, actually, to us. Scientists love to get into complicated analyses and models and so on. So I thought about this and said, SDGs, and we're not going to get 9 environment goals in SDG. We might get 1. We might even get 2. And at the global level, which I think you have to think about now in terms of SDGs, what would be the 2 out of the 9 planetary boundaries that I would choose? Well, the 2, probably one of them won't surprise you, and it is climate. And there's a good reason for that. We need a stable climate system, or all else isn't going to work very well. In my lifetime, I'll still have a stable climate system. It isn't changing that fast, but not in my grandchildren's time. And that's really what we have to think about. The second one may surprise you. It's biodiversity. Why is that so? Biodiversity is the underpinning capital resource that supplies all ecosystem services, fresh water, forests, food, etc. We need to have a biodiverse, rich planet to make sure we have resilience, we have capability to evolve, capability to adapt. And I think if we could get those 2 right, and interestingly, there are conventions on both of those. If we could get those 2 right, the other 7 are going to start falling into place. So I just want to leave you, I think, with 2 messages out of all that ramble about planetary boundaries and SDGs and so on. 2 ideas I'd like to stick in your mind. One is we have to stop thinking about trade-offs, either or. We have to start thinking about synergies at all scales, including the planetary. We have to use our wisdom to look for situations that benefit both livelihoods, development, and so on, and benefit the environment. And I think we have to, second point, we have to stop thinking about users and usage and multiple uses and think about stewardship. That should be the buzzword for the 21st century. We are stewards now of the Earth system, the planet we operate. And it's in our own self-interest to be good stewards because ultimately everything we depend on comes from the Earth system. So I wish you well for the rest of the conference, and I'm very much looking forward to listening to some of the other discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.